I have two friends here today. Good afternoon to Ken, and good
who are
morning to
also
Sarah from Tokyo,
friends
who are
of
also
one another.
friends. Yes, yes, this is why
Yes.
Ken is here too. So
Yes.
people will remember about a year ago, Sarah came on to promote a forthcoming book on the Transfiguration. That had a number attached to it, and her new book has a number attached to it too, a much bigger number. But she is here to talk about a project she has
Is it
done on
100,
the Ascension.
144 ways to think about the ascension?
Well, come on. What's the magic number
40.
with the Ascension, Ken? You can
40.
guess.
666?
No. 40 facets of the Ascension this time
Okay.
around. I thought I might continue with the 7, like with the Transfiguration, but the Transfiguration is honed and concentrated in the New Testament. The Ascension, the image that came to mind was a busted gemstone up in the heavens that shattered and scattered all over the earth and landed in little bits and pieces all over the New Testament. Hence,
And
multiple facets.
very few people know how to put them back together again.
Is
Yes.
Would you argue
So
that the
Sarah,
ascension is also in the Old Testament?
hold on, Ken.
Oh,
You're just
sorry.
you're just the sidekick here. I'm driving this
Sorry.
this truck.
He's driving
Sarah,
the chariots of fire, not you.
So my first question, as someone who I've had to preach this once a year for 25 years. You have the number 40 in the subtitle of your book, but which is it? Is Jesus? Does he ascend to heaven on Easter night or 40 days after the resurrection?
Well, would you like me to answer from the Gospel of Luke or from the Acts of the Apostles? And
Right.
if you
Well,
want to
there you go.
go from the Gospel of John, we could say something more than 8 days later.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
I have
So
to
start
say,
just talking about just how all over the place the scriptures are.
yeah. Okay, so I feel like I, and probably most preachers, have read Luke 24 a lot because, it's pretty awesome. Road to Emmaus. And I can't believe that I never noticed before that it's just one continuous piece of action. And that and not only is it a continuous piece of action, there are so many time indicators in the prose itself. Like, so I went through after I, read in the biblical scholarship, like in the Gospel of Luke, it's Easter night. It's like, what? No. And then I actually paid attention. It's like, it's always been there and I missed it. I would say that was probably the biggest shock of the whole thing. It took me a while to recover from that one. But then you go to the beginning of Acts and it says 40 days later, very unambiguous. In Acts 13, it does say many days rather than 40 specifically, but many days and 40 days in the Bible is basically the same thing anyway. So, yeah, so there are many ingenious solutions to the discrepancy, especially since it seems very clear Luke and Acts are by the same author. Some of the more creative ones are there is actually a time pause in Luke 24. You just have to insert it somewhere. Another one is that Luke did not necessarily know he was going to write an apostolic history when he finished writing the gospel. And once he turned to that project with heaven knows what kind of time, I mean, we have absolutely no way of knowing if there was and how long there was of a time gap. But supposing there was, and then supposing he was like, all right, having collected the kerygma about Jesus, I will go collect the kerygma about the apostles. He found out that it wasn't the same night. And, there were traditions about there being this period before the ascension. And so either he couldn't, edit or retract the end of the gospel, or I think the most significant truth probably is it didn't bother him. And I finally concluded, therefore, it probably shouldn't bother me.
In your new book, did you start it by saying, in as much as I told you, I put things in good order in telling you about the Transfiguration, now I'm going to do that with the Ascension?
You stole my move. Yes, that's going to be in the introduction for sure. How could I resist that temptation?
Well, and Ken's joking, but there is continuity, right? And I think it gets it to one of the continuity helps address what preachers find difficult about the Ascension passages, right? So in Mark's Transfiguration, you have they only see Jesus transfigured briefly, and then the cloud kind of settles over them, right? The cloud of God's presence. And Luke has, as it's not so much Jesus going up so much as the cloud the same cloud taking him. So talk a little bit about just the difficulties the image itself has for people in a post Copernican world.
Right. Well, I think the first problem is that we're complete bigots about ancient people and think they're kind of dumb. And I don't think they're dumb. I think they knew, just like we do, that virgins don't actually conceive and that dead men really don't resume bodily life. So, I mean, if you're finding some way of us and them coping with that, it doesn't seem like the ascension should be such a big problem. And also, I think the up aspect is both really important because we live on a planet that exists because of gravity. And up and down are among the most fundamental experiences of being a creature on this earth.
Mm.
So I don't think there's anything kind of either theologically or metaphorically or physically suspect about talking about Jesus moving up. I mean, he's already been down, right? He was buried in the earth. He's already been horizontal a lot, walking all over Palestine. So, I mean, where else was there to go but up, to adopt the old proverb. But also, I think there's some way we really, I mean, like, people think that Jesus is a hot air balloon, right? Like he's just shooting
Mhm.
off, but sooner or later he's going to get to a thin layer of the ozone or the stratosphere, and then even a resurrected body is going to have a hard time. But again, if you look carefully at the way Luke is the only one who depicts the ascension. Many other authors talk about it, but he's the only one who depicts it. Even so, he's lifted up, but it doesn't say like he's lifted up and just keeps on going till they can't see him because he's vanished from height. Acts, not Luke, but Acts specifies that the cloud, almost like the word is like scoops him up, like grabs him from below, envelops him, and then he's gone. And but even in the Acts version, it's clear the point is that he is going to God's more immediate presence. And in Acts, it especially specifies God's immediate presence comes to him. So kind of with Jacob's ladder, it goes both up and down. It's not like a one-way elevator only.
Mm-hmm.
Do those clouds at Jesus' ascension, do they function as kind of the antipode to the clouds in Luke's story of Jesus' baptism? Where he changes Mark's language, of course, from being ripped open to being opened.
Mm-hmm. I think that probably what Luke is doing is something more like preparing you for the Parousia, because specifically in Acts that has the cloud, which the Luke 24 doesn't, it also has the two men in dazzling white who says, stop gawking up at the sky. He's going to come back the same way you saw him go. And the most commonly invoked Parousia passage in the New Testament is from Daniel 7. He will be coming on the clouds. But that is a tiny bit ambiguous because clearly the cloud in Acts 1 is the vehicle of divine presence, like on Mount Sinai, whereas in the Daniel 7, it's not absolutely clear that that's supposed to be synonymous with God's presence. I'm sure that Luke intends you to conflate the two, but he's quite respectful of his sources. He'll make some tactical omissions or inclusions, but if he can't quite push it all the way, I think he just holds back.
Yeah,
I spent a lot of time trying to... Oh, go ahead.
Does he also want to make a direct line to the Transfiguration then?
I think the reason actually why I decided to work on the Ascension this year is because by the end of the Transfiguration project, I realized that Transfiguration and Ascension somehow are more connected to each other in their depiction than either is to the resurrection. There's a kind of like holy, I don't know, like circle around the resurrection. I think probably because the resurrection actually is the hardest claim of the entire New Testament. So you can't mess with it. You can't let other things interfere or make it too easy to project things onto, in a way that the Transfiguration and the Ascension both have this kind of visionary, not of this earth quality. And the resurrection is so grounded on the earth and so focused on the body. I think my conviction now is that the reason why Luke breaks the apostolic reserve to depict the ascension, not just talk about it, but depict it, is because for him it functions as the rear guard action to protect the bodily resurrection. And I think the reason why is because I'm giving all the game away. Please get my book anyway, folks. But exaltation language is also very common across both testaments. But you can talk exaltation even with the implicit up, like altitude in the word exalt, without talking about a bodily resurrection. And I think Luke is deeply concerned, probably already from where he's writing from, that people are super happy to talk about an exalted Lord. They're a little hesitant about this bodily risen Lord. I think the ascension is what forges the link between resurrection and exaltation, so that exalted Lord cannot leave the body behind. And I think that's just, yeah, I'll stop there.
And that, I mean, that
Can
raises
can we establish the German word for ascension before it comes up later and in an inappropriate way?
Yes. Would
Do you
you
know the
like to
word?
say it, or shall I?
Well, do you know it, Jason?
yes, I can't reproduce it, but I do remember it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Himmelfahrt.
Christi Himmelfahrt.
Yes.
I was in Nuremberg on Christi Himmelfahrt, 2007. Wow, that's 18 years ago, and with a group of students, and was just stunned at what a huge festival it is in Germany.
Mm.
It's a high holy day. It's a national holiday in Germany. And I went to the main church on this city square in Nuremberg, and it was packed. And we got to commune with other Christians in another language on Ascension Day. It was eye opening for me, and that's when I started understanding that this was way more than I ever thought it was.
Mm-hmm. And that was a Thursday then. It wasn't punted forward to the following Sunday.
No, it was the day.
Yeah.
So Sarah, talk. So you mentioned that Luke is concerned to show this and not just reference it out of concern for holding on to the resurrection of the body. And I think often language of Jesus's exaltation to the right hand of the Father gets talked about in a way that makes the Spirit the presence of an absent Jesus. And so talk about Christ as an active agent in the world, and the body of Christ not being removed from us. How do we hold all of these things together?
Right. So just drop the other half of my book for people for free. Okay, I'll do it. It's too important not to.
To be fair, I haven't read it, so I didn't know that I'm stumbling into the second half.
No, that's okay. Well, nobody has.
We're going to buy it for your delightful prose.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think until, again, I started digging into this, probably if I thought about ascension at all, other than, like the dangling feet, and Endurer and other wonderful paintings. I actually think that's quite important. There's something so grossly bodily about feet. It has to be real. But, he's going up, right? And so you can't see him anymore. You can't contact him anymore. There is obviously something different happening here. And then, quite obviously, the next thing that happens after the ascension is the Pentecost, which is the, downcoming, the descension of the Holy Spirit. And I think it's very easy to read that and be like, okay, Jesus goes away and the Spirit comes. And that's the way Jesus in his final discourse in John talks. It's to your advantage that I go away. But I think what I always took from that was that somehow you needed to have not Jesus in order to have spirits, right? You could have one or the other, but you couldn't have both at the same time. But then reading much more carefully what's being said, and can I just say you didn't grow up Christian, Jason, but I find that so much of being a Christian at my age...
You grew up as much Christian as a lot of Christians are.
Okay, fair enough. I grew up in a pretty immersive household, but I still now, almost 50 years into it, I spend so much time actually understanding what I've read so many times and haven't seen the ascension taking place on Easter night in Luke 24. Anyway, it seems to me what's more going on in the New Testament is not that Jesus has to go away in order, because they have to trade places, but actually the risen, ascended, and exalted Jesus sends the Spirit, like it's his job and task and authority to send it. And so he ascends in order to send the Spirit, not to be replaced by the Spirit. And then the Spirit has the Spirit's particular mission, but then Jesus continues to have his particular mission. It doesn't like cease or go on hiatus, or to use the all-time worst doctrinal term, the session at the right hand of the Father, which to me sounds like the Trinity is trapped in an eternal committee meeting. You know, that's not the reason to be a threefold God, right? But it does there. But there is something that the sitting language again is easy to misunderstand. To us, it feels like relaxing. That's not, for instance, what Hebrews or Psalm 110 means by it. But definitely there's this, and then you just kind of like follow carefully what's happening in the New Testament. The Spirit has particular Holy Spirit jobs, but the Son continues to do particular Son things that are not the same. And where it starts to get all really wonky is how we try to conceptualize the ongoing bodiliness of Jesus. The Spirit's easier to cope with because being fundamentally non-material the way the Father is, it's easier for us to figure out this. Oh, the Spirit can be everywhere, no problem. This is where we get terrible Reformed Christology. There, I said it, but sorry guys, sorry Bart, you tried, but not good enough.
If the Spirit is, as Luther asserts in Bondage of the Will, throughout Bondage of the Will, you know, whenever he talks about the Spirit, it's never disconnected from the Word.
Never, ever, yeah.
Ever. And if that's the case, then the Spirit is embodied.
Right. Well, I think maybe so there's a way to interpret that badly, like unless it happened to you while you were reading a Bible passage, it wasn't really of the Spirit. I think the Spirit will drive people to places where they can hear the word. And that might happen in totally non-word of God context. As you probably saw, and I have certainly seen being here in Japan, is the Spirit has to use a different strategy in order to get people somewhere in the neighborhood of the word of God. But I think Luther's point there would be if he were imagining outside of an 100% or almost 100% Christian context, that the point of what the Spirit is driving people towards Jesus, but is not a replacement for an absent Jesus, as you said, Jason.
So okay, so you're both Lutheran. How can Jesus be both at the right hand of the Father and the loaf and cup on every table on a Sunday morning?
What Luther would say is, because the word says so, it doesn't matter if our mathematics or physics are not up to the challenge. I think, there's a way to do also like mystery language in a really cheap way, or we can't possibly understand it badly. But that's often invoked in things where there is some room to understand and grow into it. Luther has no objection. He obviously is an intense humanist and intellectual and will understand as far as he can possibly go. I think let's
also,
all right,
he also understands Jesus as the Word, and
right.
that if the sacraments are physical elements, if they're commanded by Jesus and they include physical elements that the Word is attached to, that Jesus is always going to be present there, that wherever the Word is, that he can be in two places at once.
Right. So I think this is where the ascension actually becomes really important and useful to us, because there is a way to talk about Christ's presence in the Word or even in the sacraments that just kind of dodges the problem of him actually being a risen body. And one thing that sort of hyper-focusing on the ascension has forced me to see is, however this problem is solved, it can't be somehow avoiding the body of Jesus. And I have a greater appreciation for Luke Acts being an entire defense of general resurrection and also Jesus' resurrection. For him, that's the scandal, whereas for Paul, it's much more that Christ is crucified is the scandal. But in either case, the body of Jesus is itself the scandal. And I think what the Ascension pushes us toward, and I think this is where Luther was finally trying to help shift Zwingli. Let's, for once in my life, I'll say one nice thing about Zwingli is he asked a good question, right? And the question is, if there is any bodily integrity to Jesus, then how can you possibly talk about his omnipresence? That is a fair question. His answer is bad, but it's a good question to ask. And I think what you see in the Ascension, as Luke Acts depicts it, but also, for instance, the way Paul starts trying to talk about the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15, the language is really weird and complicated, and it's obviously trying to take words in places that they haven't been before in order to try to catch up to this new thing that has genuinely happened through the resurrection of Jesus. And I think it matters tremendously that we are talking about the risen, ascended, and exalted Jesus, who is able to be present in the loaf and the cup, or in the least of these, or in the church that is being persecuted. These are all ways the New Testament talks about Jesus actually being present even after his ascension and exaltation, but it's because he's a risen, ascended, exalted Lord. So it's I think we'd call it like that sort of inaugural eschatology that's pointing us towards somehow the material creation itself, again, think Romans 8, is awaiting some kind of transformation or exaltation. And Jesus, as the pioneer, is the first instance of that. And so we're already making contact with it through things like the sacraments or the word or the needy or the martyrs or something like that. And that's the way the body of Jesus can still be absolutely essential to who he is and his presence, while accounting for the fact that normally bodies don't do things like this, just like bodies don't normally rise from the dead or conceive without the help of a man.
Is it possible that right hand of God, where Jesus is sitting, which of course indicates that God is left-handed?
He's not sitting on the right hand of God, just at the right hand of God.
He needs freedom to move. At any rate, it's the whole location question, right? And can we think of that right hand of God as wherever the Spirit shows up and moves me to absolve you of your sin, or to say I baptize you, or I'm just wondering.
Luther is quite hilarious on the location question, and this is where he gets most irritable and most funny, without being the worst version of himself. But yeah, he says, like, right hand of God is not an address, like the temple in Jerusalem is an address. The right hand of God is not. He said, when there actually is a metaphor in play, acknowledge it's a metaphor. When it's not a metaphor, like this is my body, then don't try to bring metaphor into place. So the idea, I mean, and this was again the kind of Lutheran polemics against the Reformed, but Jesus being at the right hand of God doesn't mean he's chained there and cannot get to earth. Right hand of God is about the power of God and the presence of God. And that's where, kind of you take the leap from the omnipresence or ubiquity into the ubi voli presens, one of my all-time favorite weird Latin theological terms, which is Christ is everywhere that he wants to be. and there you get kind of the larger sense of God, of course, is present at all times to his creation. How could he not be? But in what manner or mode is he present? I mean, we've all had parishioners or part-time parishioners who are quite insistent that they can meet God on the golf course or in a beautiful natural setting or all sorts of things. And like, sure, there's no reason why you couldn't, but if you want to reliably encounter the gracious God who actually cares about the fact that you were born and intends to bring you to himself and raise you from the dead, you're more likely to reliably meet him at the communion table or in the presence of the word of God being preached and proclaimed than you are even when you score a hole in one. You probably don't score a hole in one.
If the bodily risen Christ is not limited by geographical location, does that also mean that Christ is not limited by historical location? that he is present in the past. Jason preached a sermon when our Iowa Preachers Project gathered in California last month, where he talked about how Christ, how his mercy works across time, and that he heals time itself as a created thing, and that he has the ability to, in the resurrection, to change your timeline. That he can be present in your past where you have done something irreparable, and make things right.
Well, I think you just gave the answer right there. I have to. This is a little underdeveloped.
You can credit me in the second edition of the book.
As this might be a little bit too tidy of a schema. I'm still thinking through this part, but I'm playing with the idea of the ascension being something of like the redemption of space, and the Pentecost and sending of the Spirit being something like the redemption of time. And not to prove theology from physics, but where we are at now scientifically, we know space-time is a unity. So of course, all the works of the Trinity are done together. If there's redemption of space, there has to be redemption of time. They're mutually entailed. I think seems to me somehow the Spirit would be more the active agent of redeeming time, maybe by carrying Christ backwards. Yeah.
I'm hoping that Mass will also be redeemed.
Yes. Well, Mass is intrinsic to space, so I think you're safe, Ken.
Okay.
Yeah. Because a great aha moment for me was reading Jensen on the Ascension, and solving what appeared to be the problems with the text in terms of location and trajectory, and saying that Jesus is raised and ascended into the future, as the first occupant of the eschaton, and from there all parts of time are available to him, and that was really elegantly done. But what you said earlier, those problems don't necessarily need to be solved, because Luke does not have as retrograde an understanding of the cosmos as we might think.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I mean, there is clearly, I mean, if the Son and the Spirit are actually God, then omnipresence in both space and time have to be part of who and what they are, and how they undertake their missions from the Father. So there's always a way in which theology needs to it can go too far in trying to conceptualize perfectly and create an unassailable schema, which of course some future generation is going to smash to pieces. But if what we're doing is removing obstacles to faith and the more like ad hoc sort of apologetics, I think that's a useful enterprise to undertake. And it's been my impression. I mean, I definitely heard from people that they hated preaching on Transfiguration Sunday the most, because it seemed so tremendously important and they had no idea what it was supposed to mean. And neither did I, which is why I wrote the book. But Ascension it's either Ascension or Trinity comes in second place. I think Ascension is easier to avoid because it's on a Thursday and you can, just not deal with it the following Sunday. But I really think, I mean, myself to some extent too, are stuck with the, rocket ship Jesus and those dangling feet and what are we supposed to do with it? So being able to reclaim, up but not so far up, and omnipresence language while maintaining genuine bodily integrity to the risen and ascended Lord. I think that's all it like with any doctrine or motif in the scripture, it ends up being the portal to everything else. But sometimes focusing on one little dot or one little wormhole can be really helpful in figuring out how all the other pieces fit together.
So you mentioned the exaltation language in both testaments. I'm guessing if there are preachers who are not afraid of dealing with the Jesus having drunk fizzy lifting drink or something, if they're willing to if they're willing to take on the text and preach on the Ascension text this year. There's going to be a lot of sermons emphasizing that Jesus is Lord and not the once and again president. So talk about, just talk about, I guess, the challenges of the lordship component to the Ascension, and how to keep that gospel and not law.
So wait, tell me first how that turns into law.
I think it could easily, in the same way that like any of the Old Testament prophets, like you can easily take one of those texts and just use it as a pivot to talk about politics.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'm not in America. I don't have to listen to that nearly as much as you guys do. So interestingly, last night I was just talking to Ken's and my mutual friend, Pastor Topo, one of the Japanese Lutheran pastors here, and he was just observing that incarnation is almost too unproblematic for the Japanese, because like many East Asian religions, God's God, the divine, the higher supernatural powers are getting incarnate all the time, like big whoop. it's when you get to something more like the lordship of that incarnate over person over all others. That's where the stress point begins to emerge. And there's lots of ways in which we can talk even joyfully about the risen Lord, like defeat of death, and not assign to him lordship overall. And so this is where Psalm 110 ends up becoming, in a way, not just it's the most quoted Old Testament text in the New Testament, which is saying something. Because again, the more you spend time with the scripture, the more you read that like the New Testament in some ways is like there's Jesus, and then all the other connective tissue is like snippets of the Old Testament, like filling in everything else. But Psalm 110 is definitely the overall winner. And it's the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I have made your enemies your footstool. That is fundamentally a lordship passage. Jesus is Lord. And the kind of the two directions that becomes really important as gospel, but as deeply challenging gospel. The first is that Psalm 110 is actually what gets Jesus in trouble. I never quite got this before, but all the synoptics have discussion about this when Jesus introduces it. So people are asking him these questions and challenging him, but he's the one who brings in the Psalm 110 passage. And I think it's functioning analogous to in the Gospel of Mark, when the rich young man comes and says, good teacher, and Jesus says, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. It's not Jesus disclaiming his godness. It's him challenging the young man to understand actually who he's talking to. And in the same way, this Psalm 110, well, how could David be Lord, all these kind of question about what it means. And people are puzzled or hear him gladly or something like this. But then that comes back, and this is right before his betrayal and arrest. Then when he's in front of the religious council in Jerusalem, it's that and Daniel 7. Those are kind of the focal points, and they're super mad about all kinds of things, but it's that particular association of himself with Psalm 110 that finally makes them cry blasphemy. And then one more point along that, in Stephen's sermon in Acts 7, they don't like what he has to say, because I mean, honestly, Stephen is a bit of a provocative jerk in that sermon. Like he goes through this whole history of Israel. Most of it is proving like, look, I also hold Moses in super high regard. And then like the very end of it is, you killed the author of life, and they're enraged and they grind their teeth. But what pushes them over the edge is when Stephen looks up and sees Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father. That's when they stone him. So this exaltation to lordship in Psalm 110, that is in some ways the final breaking point across the passion. I mean, the narratives of Jesus' life. So let me pause there.
Okay, you were about to say something.
I was just thinking about what it means for me if in my baptism I have been bound to this new Adam who has initiated this new thing. Um, does that mean that is it helpful for me to think about an ascension for myself as well? And that's of course linked to all the language that so many people use about what happens when you die. You know, that you're like a weasel in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You know, that you die and you get wings and a harp and a halo, and you rise up like prayers and incense. Um, what what does the ascension mean for me?
Mm, mm. So I think this is another case where the resurrection is clearly different from the other Christological moves. Only Jesus is and ever will be transfigured. Also, only Jesus will ever ascend the way he does and be exalted to the right hand of the Father like he does. Those are distinctly and uniquely Jesus, Son of God, only things. Resurrection is the thing that gets shared with us. And again, like you can see from 1 Corinthians 15, something changes in what it means to be a body. We're still somehow definitely bodies, but there's some transformation, or like I've been trying to say, exaltation, not to the right hand of the Father, but exaltation of the body in some sense will happen. So I think that is the promise to hang on to. But what you described, and what still is so deeply in our religious culture, even after thousands of years trying to extricate ourselves from it, people still basically think salvation is getting rid of their bodies. And if the body of Jesus is at stake, both literally and metaphorically in the New Testament, the conclusion from all of that is therefore our bodies are also at stake, from everything from martyrdom to their ultimate destiny in resurrection. So any kind of conceptualizing of a future state that is not bodily is simply wrong. It's just almost in a sense, without people even knowing it, it's the deepest betrayal of confession in Jesus, is to think that you get to not have a body and that's salvation.
Yeah, I think we do a
And
poor job of, um, it's and they're all linked, right? That we tend to think of the resurrection as Jesus' life starting up again, um, rather than
Yeah. A
he was dead.
resuscitation. Yeah.
Um, we think of heaven as the place where God lives, um, and we think of um, salvation as the ascension of our soul, um, to a place where God lives, where we will have no vocation, rather than we are the bride of Christ and will have a share in God's life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Philip Pullman's great series, the Golden Compass, Subtle Knife, etc. A plot point in that story. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read the books.
they've been out for like 30 years. I think
I know, but still, there are people who haven't read the books. Is about this
Aslan
instrument,
dies. What?
this instrument that severs people from their animal familiars.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That in spite of having been written by an atheist, I've always read as this attempt to split body and soul. And that from what you're saying, Sarah, the ascension doesn't allow us to do that at all, even for us.
Yeah, and Philip Pullman, like many atheists, has actually no idea what his actual target is.
Yeah.
It's almost sometimes comical and rather sad how often atheists and secular humanists miss the mark. But I suppose if they were open to learning theology, things would be very different from them. But yeah, no, there's no self without a body. I think people are really upset by that, and it is weird to. The fact that we are the only creatures, as far as we know, who can reflect on the fact that we exist, who even can conceptualize a mental process separate from the body, it's not true. I don't follow very closely, but a lot of current like neuroscience, cognitive science is realizing, and this is why people are so wigged out by like large language models and AI, because it's attempting to replicate in a machine process the kind of knowledge that can only come from being embodied. And that's, of course, why it gets wiggy and weird. And as often, well, this is going in a whole different direction, but humans have always been so enamored of their technology and have tried to make themselves in the image of their technology rather than in the image of God. Even the old, critiques in the Old Testament of those who worship them are like them, dumb, mute idols. We are always trying to remake ourselves by this tech that we admire. That's very much the present right now, but we do not have the thing that we would like to liberate from the body apart from the body. You could, well, even if you claim to conceive it, whatever you're conceiving is not it. And yeah, people are just so there's a level. I mean, people have always been unhappy in their bodies for various reasons. Death sucks, illness sucks,
Getting old
childbirth is
sucks.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting old sucks, right? All like it's an understandable complaint. On the other hand,
Cancer, however, is funny. Sad.
But on the other hand, it's not like having a mind is a picnic either.
Yeah.
So I never quite understood, like, why would you want to have a mind without a body either?
My mind is too noisy. I'd rather be a body.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think a lot of, so-called vices or real vices, are attempts to just shut down the mind in preference to at least some facsimile of bodily existence or pleasure or whatever. But yeah, we are weird things.
So talk about, I mean, so if ascension holds this body, spirit, these correlatives together, talk about social media and how it's subhuman.
Can I call it demonic?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you are free to rant for the next 5 minutes.
All right. Yeah, well, I mean, once you kind of get the lens to see that there is, it's hard to be human. It is genuinely a trial. The whole creation is groaning out in labor pains. Fair enough. Like was Zwingli, let's acknowledge the problem. But almost every solution we try is purely imminent, and nowadays more than ever technological. I mean, again, like there've always been ways of trying to escape it, whether it was ancient forms of Gnosticism or vices or whatever. But I think there's like this renewed passion nowadays to think that really technologically we can solve the problem of being human. And you cannot solve the problem of being human. Only God can solve the problem of being human. And he does it first by killing us, and then by raising us to new life in which our very materiality somehow will be transformed. And like I've even heard this new idea, like we're really going to pull off radical life extension. Again, like, why would you want that?
That's Bill McKibben's book, Enough.
Yeah.
Right there, where he talks about science wanting to extend human possibility infinitely, whether it's with nanorobots or eliminating disease in other ways. And his conclusion at the end of that book is the best way to be human is to go for a run and to face your limitations.
Right.
To know that you are not all extensive.
Right. But I think it is really important for people to find out what their limits are in reality. I mean, I think a lot of what are now fairly cheap objections to, social pressures or whatever is, keeping people down or under constraints. I think people have to try, like that's when you're no longer trying to save yourself by your works, like as one of you said, vocation, right? You have a vocation. Why not try and find out how far you can go? Because you will hit a limit. It's a God-given limit, whether it's biological or mental or psychological or whatever. But people aren't happy not finding out what their limits are. And what makes the tech part really creepy is that it doesn't acknowledge the limit at all. It's not just extending it. It just thinks the limit is definitionally wrong in human experience.
Can I ask you a real basic question?
Sure.
What other readings are assigned in the lectionary for Ascension Day? Do you know?
I haven't even looked.
I mean, I'm just wondering if
Jason knows I have a history with the lectionary.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if the ascension of Elijah is one of the readings for that day.
May I say some words about Elijah? I would
Yeah.
love to say some words about Elijah. So, a lot of people assume that Elijah's ascension and possibly Enoch's, whatever happened to him, are the templates for what happened to Jesus. I think Luke is trying aggressively to distance what happens with Jesus from what happens with Elijah. Because Elijah, of course, would have been so honored, respected. He is the one that shows up with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. I think Luke wants you to have no doubts. It's not the same thing at all. And it's just the same way that the resuscitation stories like of Lazarus or Jairus's daughter or the son of the widow of Nain, those are resuscitations, not resurrections. Whatever's happening with Elijah and Enoch is different in kind from what's happening with Jesus.
Well, neither Elijah nor Enoch get any attention at all from the lectionary, because this is a good example of a rant Sarah has done for me before about how in Eastertide the lectionary does away with the Old Testament entirely and replaces
but
it
it gives us 6 weeks of passages from Revelation, which is nice.
That's great,
but in 1 year of the lectionary.
Yeah, well, that's great. And that's what the second lesson from the New Testament non-gospel portions should be. What's wrong with keeping the Old Testament the Old Testament?
Can we also add Palm Sunday to that and have an Old Testament reading on Palm Sunday, please?
Yeah. Yeah, again, the more I go into scripture, the more I realize every jot and tittle of the New Testament is incomprehensible without its Old Testament background. The idea that I was just talking to someone else who said when she was going through seminary a couple decades ago, all of her Bible professors said that the New Testament had nothing to do with the Old Testament. It was a fresh start entirely. Like, well, they must have never read the Old Testament if they came to that conclusion. Or the new, well, yeah, but I mean, if you don't know where it's coming from, you just think it's like the little, like Matthew, who's really obvious about his proof text, and you think that's it. But like the warp and weft of the whole thing is the scriptures of Israel.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, because yeah.
We don't need to redo the lectionary rant. That's okay.
Well, I mean, it's people. It's important for Christians to understand that these key convictions that we have are either, like in the case of resurrection, like a Jewish hope, or images that are inextricable from the Old Testament, like exaltation in the right hand of God.
Right.
Because otherwise they just become stories about Jesus.
Right. Right. What's kind of helped, the kind of mental shift I've taken is to look at the New Testament is the apostles actually experienced this phenomenal person of Jesus Christ, right? I mean, that who he was, how he was, everything that happened to him is just stunning in every possible way and astonishing. And he himself clearly starts the process of interpreting who he is, what he's about to do. But, once he is, dead, risen, ascended, they have to continue the process of thinking it through. And what resource did they use? They used their scriptures. Of course they did, because Jesus himself was using their scriptures. But it also stands to reason that after they've actually gone through the process of seeing him die, rise again, ascend to heaven, then they're going to need more help interpreting. So for instance, in Hebrews, this is the unique witness of the New Testament that finds in Melchizedek in Genesis a helpful motif for interpreting what Jesus is. And I think this also kind of gives us permission to continue to ransack the scriptures of Israel in understanding who Jesus is. And again, let me just say, not in a way that disrespects the faith of Israel that has not acknowledged Jesus as the expected Messiah. Nevertheless, if we are going to understand Jesus at all, it has to be through the scriptures of Israel. And I think we also have to allow, there is reason to continue to dispute whether or not Jesus was it. Let's grant them all the reasons not to believe that he wasn't it. And this is something that the Parousia solves, not argumentation in this life. But so, for instance, there's all sorts of really interesting hidden corners of the Old Testament that are not used in the New Testament. But I think the way we see the apostles thinking through Jesus in light of the scriptures of Israel invites us to pick up places that they never got to, or it didn't get written down that they got
Yeah.
there, and find ways to move forward.
Yeah, oh, I mean, it's right there in the ascension text, right? Like their response to what has happened to them with Jesus is to go to the temple and worship.
Right, right.
There's
Yeah.
just there's just a fundamental continuity there.
Yeah. I think that's one way in which it really I think we have to actively teach people that there's an exile in the Old Testament and a temple destruction within the period of the New Testament. Because if you don't know that there's kind of a split in time and interpretation in both testaments over this catastrophe that takes place, it's very hard to see what's going on. And again, Luke Acts is not anti-temple. I mean, I just always assumed, because you just read these things naively, like, oh, the second Jesus is risen from the dead, we don't need these animal sacrifices anymore. Like, no, it was the Romans who put an end to temple sacrifices, not faith in the risen Jesus.
Yeah, there's a I can't remember where I read it. Michael Visegrad.
Oh, Visegrad, yeah.
Yeah. He's got a great essay, or like, I guess he was in talks with Pope Benedict, and so he posited to Pope Benedict, like, well, what if Israel rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and started doing animal sacrifices again? And like, I guess Pope Benedict chewed on that for a while and was like, well, I guess the church would have to acknowledge that God is in some way enthroned there. And I thought that was a really fruitful thought exercise.
Yeah, it's not self-evident that the one cancels out the other. And it seems to me that the reflections, like especially on Hebrews, about Jesus ascending to the heavenly temple to make the once for all sacrifice, that has to be a reflection after the destruction of the temple, in which all of them are mourning and shocked at that this has happened. I think Christian exaltation over the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is a much later, jealous, nervous, Gentile Christian retrojection. But I don't think that could have been, even the Jesus believers at that time, they couldn't have been happy about it or thought, oh, good, the temple deserved this. Like, they definitely had some issues with some of the staffing on the temple, but the temple itself what it was meant to be.
To Ken's question and point about time earlier, it's that it's not that the sacrifice that Christ performs in Hebrews invalidates the ones that come before it. It's precisely the one that gives all the ones that came before their meaning.
Right. Well, and actually, that's why Hebrews needs Melchizedek so badly, because it acknowledges that Jesus isn't qualified to be a priest. Like, he doesn't say, oh, the Levitical priesthood is a lie or invalidated. It says, well, Jesus isn't a Levitical priest, so what resource can I find to understand Christ's priestly work? And then he has to go, he finds Melchizedek and says, okay, this helps me think it through. But the whole point of it is not to invalidate the sacrifices that have come before, or the priesthood that
I feel like Hebrews is going to be her next book.
Oh, they're definitely talking about Hebrew. No, I can actually recommend an amazing book. It's called Rethinking the Atonement, not the greatest title, but by a scholar named David Moffat, who's done most of his work on Hebrews. And that was, I mean, I've tried Hebrews a lot of times in various commentaries and got bits and pieces, but Moffat's book finally cracked the whole thing open. And okay. I'll just share the fundamental insight is that it's not the shedding of the blood that makes a sacrifice a sacrifice. That happens outside. Then the priest takes the blood and brings it into the holy place. And so to think about the atonement as such only being the death of Christ is to isolate only the bloodshed part, when in fact a complete sacrifice has many steps, the final which is the presentation of blood on the mercy seat. So what Hebrews is saying is, on the cross, Jesus shed his blood. But so far, it's only bloodshed. It's only slaughter. There's nothing redemptive about that. It's when Jesus, with this risen life, can ascend to heaven and in the heavenly temple offer his own blood to the Father, then the sacrifice is complete. And that is what makes it a completed and final sacrifice that never has to be repeated. Also, because now that Jesus is risen, he will never die again. And because he's a priest, he continue to serve a priest eternally, because he will never die. There's no need to be replaced with successive generations of priests. And just that little mental shift, that atonement is a whole process, not just, bloodshed. I mean, again, right there. But it took Moffat's wonderful essays to make me finally see what was always right there in front of me.
That's good. That's real good. So Ken, you said you didn't know anything about the Ascension. Do you feel like you're equipped now to preach that
I
that
feel
Thursday?
better equipped, but I also know who to point people to when they have questions about the Ascension. I'm looking forward to this book, Sarah.
Yeah. So tell us about the timeline.
Sure. Yes. So 40 facets of the Ascension. Running a Kickstarter for it again, as I did with the Transfiguration book. It will begin on March 18th. This is 2025, and end on April 1st. No joke. And yeah, so I mean, I'm sure I'll send you a link you can put in the show notes. But if people just want to like Google Sarah Hinlicky Wilson Kickstarter Ascension, you'll find it right away. And for backers, you will get the ebook before Easter Sunday, so that if you want, you can read one facet per day. It's 40 sections, 40 facets of the Ascension. So you can read it devotionally
Clever.
from Easter Sunday through Ascension. Yeah, so that's for anybody who wants to read it. And if pastors want to use it as a resource for preaching, they got, at least 40 Sundays covered. Probably the pseudepigraphal and Greco-Roman stuff won't be so helpful in preaching, but you never know. You might have folks who are really into why a Roman emperor's apotheosis is nothing like what happens to Jesus.
Luther wasn't afraid of those books.
No, he wasn't. That's true.
There were
That's
lots
true.
of people in the Reformation that, like Johann Spangenberg, did postals, 15 funeral sermons. They were all based on books that Lutherans wouldn't regard as scripture.
I didn't know that.
Right. Well, I have to say, First Enoch is super duper weird. I am very happy that book was
It
not
is, yeah.
canonized. Yes, but I mean, that was really helpful. One other I'll just throw out there thing I've really found helpful in reading, especially the New Testament, is figuring out who they're arguing against or what they're arguing against, and a lot about the Ascension and the resurrection comes into clearer focus. Like Luke Acts definitely has Greco-Roman alternatives on the brain, as well as Old Testament and pseudepigraphal Old Testament type models that he's clearly trying to distance Jesus from. And some of the things that you find odd will become much more intelligible in that light.
When you say Greco-Roman elements, do you intend Gnostic elements?
Yeah, no, that's a
because
little bit
Gnosticism
later.
has such an aversion to the body.
Yeah. I think probably it's more like early.
Already in the mix.
Yeah, well, the Greco-Roman milieu just hated bodies anyway. The whole point of ascending is to get rid of the body, and I think Gnosticism runs with that. Early Docetism runs with that. But for instance, like when in Greek and Roman sources they talk about someone being, taken directly to their version of heaven, the word they use is disappeared or vanished. That's what Jesus does at the end of the Emmaus Supper, which I'm sure you've often wondered, like, this is weird. Why does he just vanish from their sight? And I think what he's trying to do is say, look, he vanished and then he came back. He's not just, ripped away from the earth, never to be seen again like Romulus was, right? But he can remove himself. He has that power, but he can come back. And that's when he shows, look at my feet and my hands. I'm eating a piece of fish. This is not what a spirit does. So, I mean, that was like, I always was so puzzled by that, but I'm pretty sure now that's why that one little detail is included in that weird way.
Thomas, 1600 years from now, in a Caravaggio painting, you'll lift a flap of skin up in my side.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That just broke open the Emmaus story for me.
Awesome.
So now I can preach on 2 Sundays. I can preach better.
So Sarah, where can
Sarah, give us your website for your books, not just the Transfiguration books, but also your fiction that you've written, other things that you've published. There's just so much available there that's worth your time.
Thanks. Well, my books are published mostly by Thornbush Press, so just thornbushpress.com. The Transfiguration book is there. The after the Kickstarter, a couple months into it, I'll actually publish the Ascension book later this year, aiming for Christ the King. I think that's a good connection with the exalted to the right hand of the Father theme. And I have a 500-page novel about a Lutheran pastor's family that anybody who has lived in church will find perhaps too painfully close to home, but yeah, and various other things there as well. Or you can just go to sarahhinlickywilson.com and it'll send you in every direction you could possibly want to go.
And you are, so we noted the time zone at the beginning, so you're headed back to the States?
Yes, I am coming into my final month at Tokyo Lutheran Church. That is, Kenna served for me for a month last summer, so he knows this is a wonderful
So I can
congregation.
attest to how quickly a month goes.
Yes, yes, it is very beloved, and they've known I was leaving for 5 months already, so we've had a good time to make a good goodbye. In this particular setting, I know pastors usually split faster, but it made sense here to have more time to prepare. And yeah, it's gonna be hard. But being in Japan has been very hard, but this congregation has been the highlight of my 6.5 years here. And I had such a hard and unrewarding first call. I came into this one not remotely enthusiastic and with zero missionary skills, barely any pastoral skills. But God has really taught me my vocation here. And yeah, so we are praying and discerning our way towards the next call in the U.S. And details forthcoming whenever the good Lord sees fit to disclose them to us.
When we're done recording, Sarah, I have a couple things I want to ask you. Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yes. So are you going to aim for Southwest Virginia?